Nearly 3/4 of Americans believe that the economy is in good shape. That's according to a new CBS News poll. 71% of Americans say they believe the economy is doing well. That's also true across the political spectrum. A majority of Americans say it's doing well. 60% of Democrats also agree with Republicans. And President Trump is getting some credit for the economy. 41% of people who said the economy is good believe his policies are mostly responsible. That's up from 32% since January of last year. I want to bring in CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe to look at these numbers. Ed, anyway, it's pretty good news for the president, right? He says the economy, the president says the economy is really the reason to elect him, right? How are Democrats running counter to that message?
Well, it's good news for him on the economy, and his overall approval rating is back where it was over the summer, but still well below 50%. So Democrats, when it comes to the economy, out on the campaign trail, talk about the unequal growth in this country, the inequality that exists. They continue to focus on working class Americans who may have to work more than one job or who are loaded up with either a home mortgage or student loan debt, and a belief that the wealthiest in this country are getting wealthier, and those that are not as wealthy are certainly struggling to climb that ladder. And there are plenty of surveys that show that people are concerned that they're not going to leave the next generation better off than they were. That's a sentiment that Democrats speak to as well. The other concern, of course, being that in some parts of the country, people are still struggling to find new work. Manufacturing sector shrinks. How do these people get new job training for other positions? That's another focus for Democrats. But it is indisputable, as these numbers show, that the president is getting credit for sustaining a pretty strong economy.
I want to turn and ask you about the impeachment debate. We know CNN held a town hall last night, and Beto ORourke said that he supported impeachment proceedings. He was unafraid of the consequences. I want to play that bite for you.
I understand the political implications of this, but I think this moment calls for us to look beyond the politics and the polling and even the next election. It's the very sanctity of the ballot box and the very future of the world's greatest democracy. And if this is important to us, and I think it is, then we need to look past those short-term consequences to the consequences to the future of this country. And
Short-term consequences. I'm curious, Ed, when you talk to voters and you look at the voting public, how does this issue of impeachment resonate? Does it help or hurt 2020 contenders?
It might potentially hurt them. Our colleagues Beto ORourke and Stephanie Ramirez, two of our campaign trail reporters, spent some time in recent days talking to voters in Pennsylvania and California when they were on the road, and there is concern that if Democrats in Washington focus too much on the impeachment issue, it will only galvanize the president and his supporters and make it easier for him to make a case for re-election, or at least to inspire Republicans to show up to vote for him in November 2020. So Democrats clearly can't agree on how exactly to proceed. Do you go full impeachment? Do you go impeachment inquiry? Do you just hold a bunch of discombobulated oversight hearings and hope that that kind of focus gins up concerns about the president? And then you have, of course, what happened today, where the president tried to call Democrats on trying to keep focused on impeachment while also trying to work on other issues. It's tricky. O'Rourke saying that he's not afraid of the consequences is not only speaking to his presidential ambitions, but speaks to what happened to him last year when he was a Senate candidate. He came out pretty forcefully last summer, I believe it was, when he was running for the U.S. Senate seat in Texas, and said that, yes, he supported impeachment of President Trump. There are some Democrats, other observers in Texas, who say when you only lose by 3%, you wonder if he had reserved judgment on that issue specifically, whether some independents or Republicans who maybe were inclined to vote for somebody other than Ted Cruz would have voted for O'Rourke if he hadn't gone so far at the time. In this context, as a presidential candidate, perhaps politically in the short term, he doesn't necessarily suffer for it. But again, you wonder if he prevails somehow, does this come back to bite him if the fears of some of those Democratic voters that our colleagues spoke with in recent days bear true.
I want to ask you also about the generational divide. This caught our attention from the Washington Post. I want to read you this. It says, the media has focused intensely on the Democratic political divide between those from safely liberal areas versus several dozen from swing districts where Trump remains somewhat popular. But the generational divide might be just as important, considering decision makers such as Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and Jim Clyburn, all from very anti-Trump districts. So is that divide reflected within the 2020 candidates that we see being fielded?
Not as much, because you really only have two candidates who have been around long enough to have any professional experience with the Clinton impeachment, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. The rest weren't, as I sit here and try to recollect, were not in Congress in the late 90s and wouldn't have necessarily something to reflect on. What Paul Kane's piece there in the Post is getting at is that if you think this is just about sort of liberal versus swing state Democrats in the House, it's not. It's people who were here in the 90s and lived through the Clinton impeachment urging some caution and some concern versus those newer folks that have just gotten here in the last few months and are raring to go on the issue of impeachment or more aggressive oversight. And the argument being there that among House Democrats at least, that's a better way to watch the debate than along ideological lines or swing state or swing district versus safe blue district kind of lines. And you know, at the Democratic presidential level, it's a different conversation because they're speaking to partisans all across the country who are inclined to support more aggressive oversight and potential impeachment of the president. It's a different calculation, and it's part of the struggle that will continue to face Democrats in the coming months.
You mentioned Bernie Sanders. I want to ask you a little bit about that. Politico reports that he'll hold his first in-person fundraiser for donors of all means. I want to ask you a little bit about his fundraising tactic. You know, he's taken a strong stance against money in politics. I'm just curious what you make of this sort of looking at his cash right now.
Well, he's in a commanding position. Finished the first quarter on top, in part because he was able to raise so much so early on and was starting with money left over from his last presidential campaign and his Senate re-election campaign last year. So he had, what, 18 million, I believe it was, roughly, at the end of the first quarter. Has undoubtedly raised more since then. Holding this kind of an event is kind of designed to troll Joe Biden, who is holding fundraisers that are open to the media with people who are willing to cut him four-figure checks. In this case, it sounds like Sanders is willing to hold a fundraiser with people who give him $4. And so that is a contrast, an obvious contrast. It's one that's, you know, sort of on the margins of the debate and one that's designed to mostly infuriate or work up Democratic primary voters who might be trying to decide between someone like Biden and Sanders, but clearly designed to sort of troll Biden, who has spent a lot of time in these early weeks of his campaign at these kinds of fundraisers. Raised $1.8 million at a Orlando event the other night, has been in Nashville, out in Hollywood, and in just outside Philly, raising significant sums of money, but taking time off the campaign trail to do it when other contenders are spending more time on the trail and relying on small dollar donations sent in online.
And I also want to ask you about your reporting and some of the stories you've covered in the past year, particularly the controversy surrounding Virginia Governor Ralph Northam, whose medical school yearbook showed a picture of a man in blackface and another in a KKK hood. The school investigated those photos. I'm just curious if you have an update and what have they found?
So Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia is where then student Northam attended and got his medical degree. They had hired a private law firm to look into this at the request of the governor. And after a 4-month investigation, which included 2 in-person interviews with the governor, they concluded, the report says, quote, "We could not conclusively determine the identity of either individual depicted in the photograph." Remember, the governor was accused of being the person in blackface. There is another person in a Klansman hood. He says it was not him, but then, of course, recounted another time where he wore blackface at a dance contest where he was impersonating Michael Jackson. He remains on the job. Virtually every Democrat in a position of power in Virginia and across the country has called on him to resign. He refuses to do so, at least so far. We are told to expect some kind of updated statement from the governor later today, but no indication yet that he would suddenly step down because of this report, which again was a private one conducted by a law firm at the request of his medical school, who suddenly found itself caught up in all of this. To their credit, the investigation included interviews with dozens of people. They just couldn't determine 35 years after the fact whether or not it was the governor or somebody else, and whether the photo was put there for malicious reasons or intentional reasons. Given that such paper trails, digital ones like exist today, didn't exist back in the 80s, it's certainly a harder thing to do.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, grateful you can join us, Ed. Thank you very much.
Take care, Rena.